welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see you all here on a Monday afternoon. This session is one of four that we'll be doing this fall. So there's this one that's kind of a one-on-one overview, and then each of the subsequent ones focus on a different aspect of the work. So I'll show you those when we get to the end of this show in case you want that information. So our agenda for today really is to look at some of the basic elements that House liaisons attend to in Illinois community colleges. So the buckets that we're going to look at today are definitions, the financial aid aspect, the continuum of care, a little bit about data, both what liaisons need to report and also kind of what we see happening at the national level. And then finally, just a little bit of thinking about the resources you have and how you roll those out to students and to other stakeholders on your campus. So I thought today we'd start with some definitions. The first big bucket basically being the definitions around House liaison duties, and then the second big bucket around the McKinney-Vento Act that really defines homelessness and is referenced in the Illinois state law. So basically, in a nutshell, the House liaisons were created through the Higher Ed Housing and Opportunity Act. And in that act, it defines about 10 duties for the liaisons to engage in. So we'll kind of talk about those. In my mind, I see them as these two buckets. One is subject matter expertise, and the other bucket is really around navigating students at your institutions. So we'll kind of talk about those buckets. And then again, McKinney-Vento really talks about what it means to be someone experiencing homelessness and the various kind of flavors that you may see in that environment. Oh, thanks, Brittany. I see you're putting registration links in the chat. So when we talk about House liaisons and their navigational duties, these are the kinds of things that are mentioned in the Act. So helping students with financial aid, acting as an intermediary between various campus offices, often, again, mediating those conversations with financial aid, connecting students to your local continuum of care. And I'll give you some information later in this show about how to go about doing that. One of the other pieces that's required in the law is that the services and resources you provide as an institution and as a liaison need to be listed on your website. And again, I have a couple examples of those where I think schools have done admirable work. So I'll show you some of those. And then if you have students who need housing during breaks, we see that probably more often with IBHE institutions, but you may see some of that at your local level as well. So helping to identify places for students during breaks, and then any other services or duties that you as a liaison think make sense and you would enjoy adding on, you may add those items. When it comes to expertise, these are really the kinds of things that'll make your job a little bit easier as a liaison. So the first is really having a solid understanding of students who are homeless and students in care. And we'll get to that here in a second. The second piece is understanding financial aid eligibility. And again, we'll look at that today. As a liaison, you personally don't need to be an expert in financial aid. Many House liaisons in Illinois are situated in the financial aid office. If that is not your background and that is not your case, that is absolutely fine, but you will want to make sure that you identify folks in financial aid that can help you with this kind of piece of the puzzle. The next bullet on here is figuring out who your continuum of care point person is out in the community. And again, I can help you figure that out with some tools that we have here today. Again, you don't need to be an expert about how services are provided in your region, but you should be able to identify services and resources that are appropriate and be able to do a warm handoff between students and those services. And then these next couple of pieces really are, again, collaborations within your institution. So how you're going to track and monitor the retention and graduation rates of students experiencing homelessness and students in care, how you're going to do just ongoing data collection and annual reporting to ICCB, and then how you want to approach training the college's employees on how students are identified and then how they're referred to you. So these are what I see as kind of your expertise buckets as a house liaison. So let's start to develop your expertise around definitions of students experiencing homelessness. So again, the law in Illinois points to this larger federal law that's explaining basically how we identify students and others, larger groups experiencing homelessness. So this is really the federal definition. So you can see here, usually this first bullet is how we tend to identify folks if we're trying to do kind of like a quick and dirty assessment, right? Because it holds all the obvious features. So an individual or a family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, it kind of holds it all. But thinking about these other bullets under it kind of help us start to think about the nuance that exists when we talk about people experiencing homelessness. So for instance, they may have somewhere to stay at night, but we don't really believe that that's a place where humans are supposed to be staying. So they may have a car and they're staying in their car. A car definitely provides some shelter, but it's not really what we would consider fixed, regular, adequate residence. So any of those kinds of pieces, folks who are currently living in shelters, or folks who are returning to one of the above listed places after they have been institutionalized for a medical reason. One of the things I always have appreciated about this particular way of defining folks is that McKinney-Vento also looks at this category of people called imminently homeless. So that means within the next 14 days, they will become homeless. And this could be people who currently own housing or rent housing, but they're about to go into foreclosure, they're about to be evicted. It could also be people who are living in a hotel, but don't currently have more than 14 days of payments available to them, and that they don't have their next residence already identified. So these are another pocket of student population that I think we also need to think about, because we may have several students who kind of fit more into this category where they're kind of on the brink, right? And this is one of the reasons why movements like rapid rehousing have become really popular and really kind of an important strategy in our state and other states, right? So we don't necessarily have to wait until the person is the technical literal definition of homeless in order to provide services, so that we can try to kind of get in here and maybe provide, back rent or, whatever it is that's kind of leading to imminent homelessness. And another piece in McKinney-Vento is there's a domestic violence provision. So if somebody is trying to leave a domestic violence situation, and that covers kind of this umbrella, so it can be domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, any of those things, and that they don't have the resources to obtain another residence away from the abuser. This also includes unaccompanied youth who are fleeing an abusive parent or guardian. So I do appreciate that McKinney-Vento really tried to give us the broadest way of conceptualizing who we mean when we talk about people experiencing homelessness. When it comes to thinking about students in care, we look to the Illinois Department of Child and Family Services for the definition. So one of the definitions obviously would be then a student is or was under the custody of DCFS. And this includes students who are currently under their care, but also youth who have aged out of the system or were formerly under care but have since been adopted or were placed into some kind of guardianship agreement. So again, kind of an umbrella here of folks that we can consider. Okay, now we're going to talk briefly about financial aid. So the Higher Ed Act of 1965 was amended, and it now considers students as independent if they're either an unaccompanied youth who is considered homeless per McKinney-Vento that we just looked at, or if they're unaccompanied and at risk of being homelessness, again, kind of back to McKinney-Vento. And the thing about this that's most interesting, I think, for students experiencing homelessness is that they can be classified as independent students, and then they don't need to report parental income information on their FAFSA forms. And the FAFSA Simplification Act really leaned into this idea. So when we think about, I realize the FAFSA simplification has been, especially this last year, a little bit less smooth than we enjoy typically. But basically, in 23-24, there were some really great changes around how we define students experiencing homelessness. So now the way we can do it is if a student was determined to be homeless in the preceding award year, we don't have to then come up with a whole new process or required group of elements to determine them again to be independent. So the nice thing there is that determination can carry forward from year to year. Another piece that's really great is that the financial aid office isn't required to ask for proof about what students are self-reporting unless there seem to be some conflicting pieces of information about their independent student status. And it's up to the institution to decide what do you think is reasonable proof related to those things. One of the things that used to happen that now has been kind of codified in this language is the HEA used to say that you could consider information from these folks listed here at the bottom of the slide. Now with the FAFSA Simplification Act, we now have this as you must accept this as proof of said situation. So just changing something from you may consider this to now you must consider this is a powerful move from the federal government to really help empower students experiencing homelessness to be able to really get their hands around some of these resources that can help them be successful in school. So these are the kinds of simplification things that have been going on. In addition to this, the folks at FAFSA have put out a couple different resources. These first two are from the Knowledge Center. And again, the first one goes over kind of all of those simplification pieces. The second one is all kinds of alerts that are coming through about ways to do this work. One of the more recent ones actually was this update where the folks at the federal level were saying, hey, we realize that there still is some old practice perhaps out in financial aid circles. So the Federal Student Aid Knowledge Center put out kind of like an update to the Simplification Act language, asking colleges to really focus on if the student is homeless or at risk of becoming homeless, and focus a little less on the reasons why students became homeless as the need for proof of status. So I thought that was really kind of a positive thing. These two pieces at the bottom are from Schoolhouse Connection, and they're an organization that does a lot of work with youth experiencing homelessness and youth in foster care. So I feel like these two documents might also be kind of helpful. The bottom one is actually an email template where you can send modify the template appropriately to your institution, and then you can send this template to students with information about FAFSA and other resources at your institution. So I thought those were potentially kind of helpful. So, and then if you do have students in care, DCFS actually has several kinds of financial support programs in place. So these are the top four, I would say, and then the link is there at the bottom. The tuition and fee waiver program covers students in the first 5 years that they're enrolled in an Illinois public university or at an Illinois community college. And then the second one, the education and training program, will cover expenses that aren't covered by the first item. So this to say, if you do have students in care at your institution and you're looking for financial resources for them, these are some options specifically from DCFS. Okay, continuum of care is a great thing that came out of the most recent McKinney-Vento, where we were trying to consolidate multiple different entities at the federal level that are looking at the issue of homelessness. So ideally, when the continuum all comes together, it increases program quality, program capacity. It helps coordinate resources in regions. Like all of those things are really great. The thing that's challenging is that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to figure out which continuum of care is yours and also who is the point person. So this link here at the bottom will lead you to the website that basically has all of the contact information for folks in the continuum, and then you can basically search for your region, your town, and put it in there, and it'll tell you. Now, here's the thing: it looks like this when you go searching. If you find that you are having difficulty figuring out who your continuum of care point person is, do not struggle. Call me. My information is at the end of this PowerPoint slide. Because this is really supposed to be an important piece of the House liaison duties, just knowing who is your continuum of care point person, and then how do you hand students off. This is important mostly because before the continuum of care, you had all these independently operating shelter and service providers. The continuum of care creates a single point of entry into that system. So now if a student wants to receive services, they don't have to fill out an application at this shelter and that shelter and this shelter, or this housing provider and this housing provider and this service provider. You can basically do a single application through the continuum of care, and then they'll get referred to the kinds of services that they need. Now, having said that, I'm going to warn you, there's not enough shelter or housing in the state of Illinois to meet the need. So one of the frustrations that commonly gets experienced by students looking for shelter and also house liaisons is that you'll be able to figure out your continuum of care person. You'll be able to even do the intake, but it doesn't necessarily change that student's living situation immediately. So that's another piece where just to be aware that when you have a student initiate the process of entering the continuum of care, that you're still going to need to be doing some kind of stopgaps before they're really placed into a permanent situation. There are some folks at your institution who may already know this information too. So if you talk to the folks in your trio program, if you have Gear Up or Upward Bound, any of those folks may already know who the person is in the continuum of care. Also, folks in disability services or adult ed may know. And if you already have relationships with your secondary partners, the secondary schools are required by McKinney-Vento law to have a liaison who works to ensure that students experiencing homelessness in that K-12 system are not missing any educational experiences and that their rights are preserved. So there is on the ISB website a locator. If you know your district, you can plug that in and then see who is your school district liaison. Okay, another big piece of what you'll be working on is the data. So I thought it would be interesting to just show you over the last few years. It was in 2019 that ICCB started really tracking the number of students experiencing homelessness in ICCB institutions. And this is done through the A1 report. It's an annual report that institutions send to ICCB about their enrollment and their student characteristics. So you can see here at the bottom in academic year 2019, there were 114 students reported as homeless. In 2023, there were 4,098. Now, that does not necessarily mean, if some of you are staring with your mouths open at the screen, it doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean that between 2019 and 2023, we had this explosion of students experiencing homelessness. What we really had was an explosion in awareness and data collection, potentially more than an explosion of students experiencing homelessness. So just wanted to put that out there first. But to just, I would say, look at the 2023 number and think like, okay, that's probably getting near to where we have a stable number. But still in all, we're depending for the most part on students self-reporting and then institutions capturing that self-report, which isn't always a smooth process. So one of the things for house liaisons to do for sure is to work with your data folks at your institution and find out on the A1 report, when they report a student experiencing homelessness, where is that piece of data coming from? And then work to kind of increase how that's captured. So some institutions may capture it on their application, which is okay, but you'll only capture it the one time they do that application. So since homelessness can be a changing scenario, you probably want to put this kind of data capture question on something that students attend to more regularly. So if it's the application, they only do that once and then never again. But if it's something like a registration form that students fill out a couple of times a year, that might be a more appropriate place to put it, or you may have other kinds of ideas. So just to be kind of thinking about how you go about actually capturing that information. There may also be some of you out there thinking, I capture it by writing their name on a sheet of paper on my desk. I am aware that there are institutions that are doing that. So if that's the way that you're doing it, still have a conversation with your data people saying, hey, I need a holder, a placeholder in the data structure so that when students disclose this, I can put that piece of information into the system, right? Because again, what you don't want to have to do at the end of the year when you're doing your report to ICCB is do any kind of hand counting or manipulation to figure out what's the number of students. So generally speaking, when you're preparing your reports for ICCB, and it's usually in the spring, and it's usually a year in arrears. So these are the kinds of things that ICCB is going to want to know. So where is the house liaison on your campus and kind of in your organizational structure? So I mentioned before that some folks are in financial aid. Folks can also be in the wellness department, in advising, some are faculty. So colleges are approaching this very differently depending on their capacity and their organizational structure. So there's no wrong answers here. We're mostly curious in finding out how everybody is kind of organizing this responsibility. So that's one part. Another piece that ICCB is going to want you to talk about is how are you communicating the house liaisons' availability and the supports that are also available. And then the obvious things like the number of students receiving services, the types of services and any outcomes that you can see from students experiencing those services. And then really the number of students experiencing homelessness or the number of students in care, that's going to come from your A1 report. So you personally probably won't be counting that official number. But again, having that conversation with your data folks around how that number is identified can be really helpful. Oh, thank you, Dina. In the chat, there's a message from Dina Schenk from ICCB. So as reporting got started, we did collect in the spring, but we'll be sending a reporting tool out in the next couple of weeks for fall collection from last academic year. Fantastic. Thanks, Dina. And then any challenges that you're having, professional development that you've done or that you think you need, will also go into that report. And then these were some of the numbers that were reported for academic year 22-23. So you can see here the number of students experiencing homelessness and students in care was just over 4,200 students. Folks who received assistance, 1,500, and students in care receiving assistance, 483. And again, that's system-wide. When we think about how this data that we're seeing intersects with the larger picture, there are a couple good resources that I just want to point out to you this afternoon. So one of them is the CESI report called Mission Critical. CESI is responsible for the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. And they do a lot of different kinds of surveys with post-secondary institutions. Find out, again, from your data folks, if your institution does this particular CESI survey with students. They've recently added, it actually started during COVID, they started adding questions around basic needs security, so basic needs and housing, and asking students how that looks in their world. So they really get into the weeds. You can see that the lack of permanent housing questions aren't just were you homeless, but they really try to get into these kind of nuances, like were you staying at a shelter, a hotel, a motel? Did you stay in a car or a vehicle? Did you stay with a friend or a relative? So to kind of get at all of these different layers of being homeless. And you can see here how when we think about were you staying in a shelter, that's 3%, but were you staying with a relative or a friend or couch surfing, that increases to 7%. And generally what their survey that they reported on in this report talked about was that 14% of students have low or very low housing security. So they're either homeless or they're students who are on the brink, right? And then the other place that does a lot of this kind of survey data is the Hope Center out of Temple University. And they have their own survey called the Real College Survey. The CESI survey actually is based on the Real College Survey. So they use some of the same questions. The Real College Survey, though, you can see 3 in 5 students experience some kinds of basic needs insecurity, that homelessness affected as much as 14% of post-secondary college students, right? And they also started getting into this data disaggregation where we could really start to see the ways in which racially minoritized students and other kinds of student groups are overrepresented in the homelessness data. So you can see here when we look at disparities by race and ethnicity, LGBTQIA status, and gender identity, that students who are non-white and LGBTQ or female tend to experience it to a greater extent. And then you can also see the middle graph is looking at students who are involved in the foster care system, students who are justice system involved, and students who are parenting all have a greater measure on this than other kinds of students. And then finally, when you look to the graph over here on the right, looking at first generation students, Pell Grant recipients, and part-time students, that they all have more basic needs in security than their counterparts. So these are, I think, also just good data points for you to have when you're also making arguments on your campuses for what kinds of resources you need in order to be able to fulfill the obligations of your house liaison duty. So leading into this, so when we think about services and resources, one of the great things about community colleges is we have so much potential to relieve the stressors of homelessness, right? When you just think about things you already do. So the kinds of wraparound services you already provide with advising and support, how you're already linking students to community resources that are out there, how your career services folks are already doing employment referrals and bringing folks on campus to do recruiting, and then just simple things too, like providing access to the internet, defraying the cost of attendance because you already are doing scholarships and book loans and supply loans, right? And just by virtue of you being there, how you provide this kind of social support network to students. And really what our colleges are also great at doing is providing the opportunity to develop what I call resilience, but in a controlled environment. So students are able to really make choices and determine the path for their future life without doing too many things that could really be risky. So all of this really helps to build students' self-efficacy and kind of take them out of these trauma situations. So I thought it would be good now, since I've been talking at you for a half an hour, if we could do a waterfall activity. So go in the chat and think about what are some of the other resources besides the items I just put on that list that your college provides that really could support students experiencing homelessness and students in care at your institution. So the way the waterfall works is put your idea into the chat and then don't hit enter just yet. I'm going to give you like 30 seconds or so to get some ideas down, and then I'll tell you when to hit enter, and then we'll have a waterfall of ideas. Yep, these are great ideas. So emergency fund, Jenny, right? Food pantry, gas cards, Walmart cards, emergency funds, Teresa. Yep. Jessica, food and hygiene pantry and emergency funding. Yeah, I know. I think sometimes we don't think about including hygiene products, but I think that's a great idea, right? Cassie, clothing closet and food pantry. George, wellness center. Lindsay, emergency housing. Great. Keith, micro pantry and clothing closet. Great. Yes. Gina, hygiene and self-care. Yes. Right. So you have all of these other kinds of resources at your institution, right? And I think also think about, do you have showers? Do you have lockers? Do you have computer labs? Do you have quiet spaces, maybe in the library or other places around campus, right? So I think you have a lot of resources that can provide supports and also just kind of safe, welcoming environments for students. Good. Thank you for participating in the waterfall. When we look at services kind of at a glance from those ICCB reports, you can see here these kinds of buckets, right? So emergency grants over here on the right, mental health counseling and referrals to the continuum of care, referrals to community resources, right? All of those kinds of pieces and parts are definitely represented in what your colleagues are doing out right now as liaisons. But one of the things we need to think about is how are we getting the word out there, right? We have all these phenomenal resources that you just put in the waterfall. How do we make sure that that frankly, not just students, but also that your staff and your faculty know that this is going on, right? So again, when we talk to the existing house liaisons, these are some of the ideas that they have. So again, using the website, which is required by statute, but also thinking about campus flyers. I feel like we used to call them pottygrams. I feel like putting those in the bathroom stalls is kind of making a comeback now that we're out of COVID. Emailing to all the students, I think is a great strategy. It's a great opt-out strategy, right? So we're going to like send the email to everyone. If folks don't need it, they'll just opt out by not engaging in that service. But if students need it, you've already reached them with the email. I think that's a great way to go. Counselor and advisor referrals, having some information for them to give to students, I think is another great way to continue to get your message out there. Some folks even went to classrooms and did presentations, or they did a specific targeted email to high school counselors so that they would know when students were coming up here, that they have services for them. Again, thinking also like who's the McKinney Vento liaison at the secondary level and how do you reach out to them to let them know. And you can see here just a lot of really smart, intentional ways to build awareness about the services that you all provide. And then definitely in one of our future webinars, we're going to talk about program design. And one of the things we do talk about is opting out. So there's opt-out versus opt-in. In higher ed, we're very much into opt-in, where if a student wants something to happen, they have to activate, they have to be the first mover. Opt-out flips that model and says like, hey, we're going to cover everybody with this. And then if you don't want it, you pull out. So for example, emailing all of the students and saying, hey, like these are the house liaison contact folks, contact points. Here are the resources that we can provide. That way, if students need it, you know they're going to get it, as opposed to if we're just emailing it to students who have self-identified, we may be missing folks, especially that we know students may not identify as experiencing homelessness if they have somewhere to stay, even if it's not a regular permanent place. One of the other things to think about too is, are there processes at your institution where every student touches that process? So for example, orientation, if you do an orientation for all new students, that could be a good place to put your information. If you have other kinds of mailings or documents that go to every household in the district or go out to every student, like a billing statement goes to probably every student at some point. So even just having a tagline on that just has something about, if you need services, here's how you reach us. And then for sure, if you can get faculty to loop into this process by putting some language in their syllabus, that would really be a great opt-out design, because students are at least receiving the syllabus. And I know we would be here all day talking about how much students read or don't read a syllabus, but it's something to think about. If the object of the game here is to design the information rollout as true opt-out, then I think that's a viable way to go about it. And again, Schoolhouse Connection has a lot of ideas around how to do opt-out design. And then when we're talking to and with students, to think about how to use plain language in order to help us get our message across, I think is really important. The first piece is thinking about that usability is really what we're targeting here. And ideally, we're hoping that they will be able to use it after reading it one time. Now, in your minds, think about your favorite page on your college website that you like to complain about. And one of the things you probably complain about is how it's quite undecipherable. So we want our language to be decipherable, really transparent, real easy to read, to be designing it, thinking that the folks who are reading it are probably in a state of stress or trauma, and making things difficult to follow is not going to help in this situation. And I fully realize that what I am advocating here probably does not conform to the college's style manual for things like their website, where they'll tell you you need to only say something one time and not repeat yourself. I'm telling you, no, you're going to need to repeat yourself and think differently about word choice and think differently about sentence structure. So ideally, we want to make it easy for them to find what they're looking for and then easy to act on the information that they find. And I put a couple resources here about using plain language in greater detail. And then our friends at Literacy Works Chicago do an amazing job doing training and resources on this topic too. So just a couple of resources. And then because I think there are some good examples out there. These examples are actually from Northeast Texas Community College. And one of the things I enjoy about their food pantry is it's very opt-out. The food pantry applies to everybody at their institution. And that can mean staff, that can mean faculty, that can mean students. And that basically if you need food, you just show up and get food. If you know of someone who needs that resource and they're not able to get there, but you can go and create a bag and give it to them. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate that they this other view over here, they've created a care center that has their food pantry plus other resources, and that they're using pictures to communicate what the different resources are. So again, thinking about like the object of the game here is have folks look at something once and be able to act on that information. So showing them a picture and then they'll be able to think, yes, that's the resource I need, click, move on that. So I just kind of appreciated that this was, to me, a really good example of using plain language or using photos to kind of get your point across. Okay, so there are several resources linked throughout the presentation. I tried to also just put some of them just here on a single page for you. So you'll have the McKinney-Vento Act full text, the Continuum of Care Finder link here, the piece on how to determine if a student is homeless from the federal student aid folks. And then our host today, the ICSPS, they have amazing resources called Super Strategies, and it's for recruitment and retention of special populations. And students in care and students experiencing homelessness are included in those strategies. So if you're truly, truly at a loss, go visit that site and you will have a bounty of ideas to kind of get going on. And then again, plain language, huge fan of plain language. So I linked that here. And then the Hope Center report and the Community College Survey of Student Engagement report on mission critical student basic needs are all down here. And then I wanted to also highlight our upcoming webinars. So last year we worked to create a handbook that has a slower version of the webinar you just experienced. And all these future webinars that we're doing have places inside the handbook. So this Wednesday, we wanted to do just like a highlight session of the sections in the handbook. It also includes some things we don't often talk about, like laws that are tangentially related to this work, things that you might find kind of surprising, but also hopefully helpful as you're hearing about these different pieces of legislation roll through, to be thinking like, oh, if that goes through, that's how this is going to work over here. So, so this to say, the handbook has all of the basics of what you need to do as a house liaison, but it also really gets into the various frameworks and service delivery models and also law. Plus, it's got a few exemplars from some of the colleges out there that are really doing great work to give you ideas about very specific elements that they're doing. So that handbook highlight is this Wednesday. And then in November, we're going to do 2 more sessions My fabulous colleague, Lynn Mackey, will be doing the sessions on house program frameworks and house service delivery models. So both of those, I think, are really great, especially if you're trying to think about how to make this work at your institution. Okay. So what questions do you have for me? How many of you are new? Okay, so Teresa, since February. Lexi, you're new. Ashley, you're new. Yes, well, welcome. Are you new? So, Ashley, when you say you're new to your role, you mean you've been at your institution, but this is a new piece for you?
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm on
Yes.
mute now. Okay. I am. I've actually been at my institution for 13 years and I took on a new position. So part of that responsibility, as I'm sure many of us can relate, one of many hats that we wear. So I am the designated house liaison and I am new and learning all of the things on top of all of the other things I need to do. But yeah, these trainings or webinars are really beneficial to me because I'm learning something every time. So it's really great.
Great. Well, welcome.
Thank
And,
you.
and if you, I should have, see, now I'm feeling like I probably should have left here. I'm just going to put my contact information in the chat. So if you need me outside of the webinars, give me a shout. That's, part of what I'm here for. Figuring out the point person for the continuum of care, I feel like has been the most common stumbling block. Yeah, Teresa. So Teresa, you've also been at your institution a long time, but then the role is new to you.
Yeah, it was housed in financial aid, and it kind of made more sense to move to our area, which we've been doing this type of work in some capacity for many, many years. So
Yes. And I think with the benefits navigator piece too, I think some schools are really moving this position over to wherever that position lives. Seems to be like kind of another trend. Okay, I'm writing down who all the newer folks are so I can check on you in a little bit just to make sure you're still got your feet under you. And then for sure, Wednesday, we're doing that session on the handbook. The handbook, though, is up on the website. So if you want to look at it beforehand or just whenever you need it, it's up there. And then ICSPS, thank you, Brittany. Brittany just posted the link to the website. And then they're also working on getting the printed copies printed and then out to you guys. So definitely be on the lookout for that.
If you go to the website, we have the little menu right there. So house webinars, you'll be able to find all the registration links for the upcoming sessions in this series, as well as additional webinars that Patty and her team have done for us. Under resources, that is where you will find a plethora of different resources. But that is where the electronic version of the house handbook can be accessed.
All righty. Well, if you have questions, stay on and ask them. If you don't have questions and you need to go, that's okay. Head on, head on to the rest of your day. But I hope that we see you at one of our future webinars, whether it's the one that's coming this Wednesday or one of the ones that Lynn is going to do for us on frameworks or service delivery in November.